How good was Paul Craig really? I don't know. Paul Craig has one of the wildest resumes in UFC history. Despite notching victories over 3 UFC champions, Paul has now retired from the sport as of September 6th, 2025, with a losing record within the UFC. And these weren't just wins over washed champions. 2 of those champions lost to Craig before they reached their titles. Magomed Ankalaev, who as of the making of this video is 21-1, only has a loss to Paul Craig. Speaking of Ankalaev, imagine if you were to have placed a bet on every Magomed Ankalaev fight and every Paul Craig fight. Who do you think would net you more profit? You would probably assume Ankalaev. Well, if you did, you'd be wrong. Not only did Paul Craig profit you despite his losing UFC record, he profits you more than every single Dagestani-born fighter ever. And that includes the most profitable Dagestani-born fighter, Khabib Nurmagomedov. This is due to Paul Craig only coming in as a betting favorite in 3 of his UFC fights, with a career average odds of plus 181, nearly a 2-to-1 underdog. If you like betting breakdowns like this, I did do a rundown of every single Dagestani-born fighter's UFC career and how profitable they'd be if you were to have bet on them. Feel free to check that video out after this one. Now switching back to Paul Craig, I did find some other cool facts about him while doing the research for this video. Now you probably could have guessed that Paul Craig holds the record for most triangle chokes in UFC history, but what you may not have known is that Paul Craig technically has retired as an undefeated kickboxer, scoring 1 professional win under a K1 rule set in Germany in 2014. Paul Craig had a career finishing rate of 100% across all 17 of his professional victories, as well as his 8-0 amateur career. In fact, Paul only went to a decision 3 times in his pro career, giving him an average fight time of just over 8 minutes. So was Paul Craig just a one-trick pony that got figured out at the elite levels of the UFC, or was he a real contender that never quite reached his true potential? Well, today, in honor of Paul's recent retirement, I'm going to be taking you through his entire career as an MMA fighter so that we can answer the question, how good was Paul Craig really? Like any good story, we'll start this one where it begins. The man that would later become known around the world as Bear Jew was born Paul Lindsay Craig on the 27th of November, 1987, in Airdrie, Scotland. As a kid growing up in Airdrie, Paul did not have the typical scrappy childhood we've heard from so many MMA fighters. In fact, Paul didn't get involved with mixed martial arts or martial arts at all until his 20s, where he found Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, which he at the time called UFC chokes.
So I didn't actually watch MMA. Like, it's a funny story. Like, started going to this class. Oh, what is it? What is it you're doing? It's UFC chokes. And I didn't learn a single submission until about 2 months into it.
And despite starting late in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, he took to it like a fish to water. After his first day stepping on the mats in 2011, his life would change forever, stepping into the UFC octagon just 5 years later. Soon after finding Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Paul made his amateur mixed martial arts debut, where he won by first-round submission, a pattern Paul would continue across his 8 amateur fights, finishing every fight in the first round. It was at this point that Paul made the jump to the professional circuit, making his pro debut in August of 2013 at First Fighting Championship in Hamilton, Scotland, a fight which he would win by triangle choke just 2 minutes into the first round, a pattern we will see a lot throughout his early MMA career. Paul then followed up this debut victory with 2 more first-round finishes, both by what had now become his signature triangle choke. Over the next 2 years, Paul racked up 5 more victories, all by stoppage, with only 1 making it out of the first round, with that lone fighter to make it out of the first round being the then 5-0 Future Bellator light heavyweight title challenger Carl Moore, who Craig easily submitted in round 2. After amassing an 8-0 record on the regional pro circuit, Paul was ready for his chance in the big leagues, but you'll find a bit of a gap in his resume around 2015 to 2016. This gap seems out of place considering how active Paul was in his amateur and regional pro MMA career. As it turns out, Paul actually couldn't get sanctioned due to some sort of medical issue, and this kept him sidelined for a bit. But once he was cleared, Paul Craig would finally get his chance in the UFC. On the prelims of UFC on Fox, Van Zandt vs. Watterson, Paul made his presence felt at the weigh-ins, donning what would become his signature Braveheart war paint. There is a bit of a story behind this. Paul actually never painted his face before his UFC debut. This idea had only been suggested to him a few days before weigh-ins by African welterweight Mike Perry. Rolling into his debut, Paul was matched up with another undefeated UFC light heavyweight prospect with a 100% finish rate. Enter Henrique da Silva. Da Silva, having already scored 2 victories inside the UFC, both by finish, came into the fight as a 2-1 favorite over the Scotsman. Against the odds, Paul would make a statement, hunting submissions relentlessly and nearly choking out the Brazilian in round 1 with a guillotine. And while there did appear to be some holes in the Scotsman's striking, Paul would score a submission victory via armbar in round 2, winning Craig what would be his first of 8 career UFC performance bonuses, which is tied for 3rd all time. In his sophomore UFC appearance, Craig would be matched with another undefeated prospect, this time Australia's Tyson Pedro. Pedro, who was just 5-0 in mixed martial arts at the time, was also coming off a UFC debut, one in which he submitted future UFC light heavyweight title challenger and future Paul Craig opponent / alleged cult member Khalil Rountree Jr. Once again, someone's O had to go, and unfortunately for the Scotsman, this time he would be on the receiving end of a round 1 finish. In this fight, Paul Craig got ate up in the clinch by Tyson Pedro. Early in round 1, Pedro dropped Craig, but called him back to his feet, an image we would see frequently throughout the rest of Paul Craig's career. Now, there's no official record for this, but I found at least 37 instances of Paul Craig being beckoned back to his feet by opponents. That has to be the UFC record. I am pretty certain. I can't think of anyone else who would have more instances of a referee getting in between them and calling them back up to their feet. Usually it was from Paul pulling guard. Sometimes it was from him getting dropped. The only guy I can think of this happens to frequently is Charles Oliveira, but I don't think it happens at nearly the rate it does for Paul Craig. Anyways, as the round continues, Paul Craig did eventually get Pedro to the ground, but at this point, he had already been hurt, and while laying on his back, he got put in the crucifix position where he would lose via TKO due to crucifix elbows. Despite taking the first loss of his career via TKO, we would see Craig again just 4 months later, which in retrospect may seem like a hasty return to the octagon. But this event was in Scotland, so I imagine this was why he made such a quick turnaround. A turnaround which he may have regretted, as he was faced off with future title challenger Khalil Rountree, with the clear deficiencies in Paul Craig's striking still being there, having only taken off 4 months in between the Pedro fight and the Rountree fight. Craig was unfortunately slimed out early in round 1 in front of his home crowd. We didn't see him shoot at all in this fight until he was already hurt, and in future interviews, an older, wiser Paul Craig said that he regretted this part of his career, trying to strike on the feet when he would have had an easier path to victory on the ground. We wouldn't see Craig again in the octagon until March of 2018 against UFC debutant and Dagestan's own Magomed Ankalaev. What you'll find is that Magomed Ankalaev won more than 14 minutes of this fight, pretty much having his way with the Scotsman, until Paul Craig latched up a last-second Hail Mary triangle choke and cranked down with all the force in the world, forcing Ankalaev to tap with only 1 second left to go, earning his second performance of the night bonus. But that quick synopsis doesn't tell the full story of this fight. Paul Craig was over a 5-1 underdog, and this was the final fight of his first UFC contract. Had he lost to Ankalaev, we may have never seen Paul Craig again in the UFC.
UFC was always my goal, and the UFC decided to cut me after that fight against Ankalaev. Then I was going to walk away.
Instead, he would re-sign and stay in the promotion for 17 more fights. Following the huge upset of the previously undefeated Ankalaev, Paul would make his next UFC appearance on the other side of the world against another undefeated UFC newcomer. This time, Paul was fighting on enemy soil against Australia's Jiri Prochazka. This is a pretty fun fight to watch back if you like grappling. With over 13 minutes on the ground and Paul going 3 for 7 on takedowns, he was pretty gassed by the end of the fight, as was Jimmy. With less than 10 seconds left in the fight, Jiri Prochazka flips the script on a very gassed Paul Craig and makes him tap to a Kimura in the final moments of the fight. We are now in 2019, the most active year of Paul Craig's UFC run, where he had 4 fights. The first of which came against yet again another undefeated UFC debutant, this time in Kennedy Nzechukwu. In this fight, we saw a lot of guard pulling, with Paul Craig hunting for arm bars. We also saw Kennedy constantly sticking his fingers in Paul Craig's eyes, with an eventual point taken in round 3. I can only imagine how frustrating it is to fight a guy with a 7-inch reach advantage who has his fingers splayed in your face the entire time. Paul did eventually return the favor with a foul of his own, a solid groin shot to the family jewels of a young Nzechukwu. With less than a minute left in round 3, Paul secures a triangle choke and gets the tap, making this the third straight fight of his that ended in the final minute of round 3. Paul would return to fight the undefeated Alonzo Menifield. Alonzo came out throwing heat, showing little regard for the strikes of Paul Craig, crashing into Craig against the fence. Paul did try to pull guard here, but eventually bailed on it, and despite some good entries on takedowns, Paul seemed to be out-muscled in this fight. Now, Paul Craig is not someone who is known for having elite striking within his UFC career, but one positive I will say about Paul's striking, throughout his UFC career he displayed a plethora of kicking techniques, including spinning back kicks and wheel kicks. In this fight, he landed one partially against Menifield. For whatever reason, he then threw the exact same wheel kick again, which Menifield easily dodged. Paul then slips and gets knocked the out on the ground by Menifield. Unlike many of Paul's previous opponents that would not engage with him on the ground, Alonzo slammed a right hand into Craig's jaw that put him out. In my opinion, this is by far the most brutal of Paul Craig's 6 career losses coming via knockout. Alonzo put him out with that first bomb and for some reason felt the need to throw 3 more. I know we all have our own opinions on whether you should follow up or walk off, and it is at the end of the day the ref's job to pull the fighter off. However, I think it's fair to criticize Alonzo for hitting Paul Craig post-stoppage, with Herb Dean having a stern talk with him in the cage post-fight. I'm not sure if this was personal or not. Either way, piece of shit move by Alonzo here. Less than 3 months later, Paul would make his return to the octagon, this time in Mexico City against Vinicius Moreira. This guy tried to pull an Uno reverse card, pulling guard on Paul Craig. But this strategy would not work out for the Brazilian, with the fight going back to the feet. It is in this fight that Paul Craig recorded his one career UFC knockdown, hitting Moreira with a vicious knee and then finishing him off on the ground via rear naked choke. Paul's next opportunity would come at short notice, his first time fighting a UFC champion, Mauricio Shogun Rua. Now, Shogun was 37 at the time of this fight and certainly past his prime, but he wasn't completely washed either, having just TKO'd Craig's former opponent, Tyson Pedro. This was also Paul's first shot against a ranked opponent. The fight was a bit back and forth, with it eventually being scored controversially as a draw. In round 1, Craig showcased improved striking, notching a decisive 10-9 or even a 10-8 on one judge's scorecard. This would come in key later. In round 2, the tides turned, with Shogun taking it to Craig, not letting him up off the ground as so many other opponents did. I can only imagine what was going through Shogun's head when he was looking at Paul Craig laying on his back. But limited by the UFC's rule set, Shogun opted for massive right hands targeted at the Scotsman. This is how the rest of the fight mostly went, with Paul Craig holding Shogun in guard and Shogun occasionally standing up only to dive back down onto Craig. This fight would eventually be scored a split draw, with one judge scoring it for each fighter and one judge scoring it a draw. Interestingly enough, this was not hometown judging, with the only non-Brazilian judge being the one that actually scored it for Shogun. Unfortunately for the Scotsman, this would be his best showing in Brazil, eventually ending his career 0-2-1 when fighting in that country. There was talk of a rematch post-fight, but that would be tabled for a bit, with Paul Craig taking on his second Dagestani opponent of his career, Gadzhimurad Antigulov. This guy is another example of a fighter shooting on Paul Craig and it not going well for them, with Craig latching up a triangle choke in round 1. This was the third triangle choke of Paul's UFC run. In the meantime, Shogun scored his third win over Lil Nog, setting up a rematch for the two at UFC 255. Going into the Shogun rematch, Paul had finally broken into the UFC's rankings, with a UFC record of 5-4-1. Round 1, Craig came out strong, scoring a decisive 10-9. In round 2, Craig kept the pressure up on Shogun, hunting for takedowns. Little did Paul know that Shogun would be hunting for an oil check, with an even more ornery than normal Paul Craig, securing the back mount and dropping bombs on Shogun until Rua tapped to strikes. This was Paul's first win in the UFC that did not come via submission, and it was Paul's only win in the UFC that did not earn him a Performance of the Night bonus. Watching this fight, I kind of wish Paul would have pursued getting his opponents back more frequently, and while he did score so many of his most notorious submission victories off his back, he really did seem effective from the back mount here against Shogun. Following the Shogun rematch, Paul Craig would take on yet another undefeated UFC prospect, this time in the form of future undisputed champion Jamahal Hill. Hill, who is 9-0 at the time, or 8-0 with a cannabis no contest, would come into the fight ranked 15. Also, I noticed that the odds are messed up on this infographic, Paul Craig was actually the underdog, the odds are flipped. After a bit of clinching, Paul Craig pulled guard, immediately searching for an armbar. After not quite securing said armbar, Paul would switch to the other arm, causing a severe injury for Hill. Hill, being tough as nails, did not actually tap at this point and continued to fight despite his arm wiggling like a noodle, so Craig tightened the triangle and dropped elbows on Jamahal Hill, while also being punched by Jamahal Hill's good arm until the referee called off the fight, officially recording as Paul Craig's second straight TKO victory. Something I think is really cool about this fight, for those of y'all unaware, Jamahal Hill and Paul Craig actually talked a bit of shit before the fight, and afterwards were able to become friends, even going out partying that night. I love to see good sportsmanship after a bout, since after all, it is a sport, it doesn't have to be personal. This would be Paul Craig's final fight against a UFC champion, leaving him undefeated at 3-0-1 against UFC champions. Now firmly in the rankings, Paul would get his first chance against a top 10 opponent back in the UK on the prelims of a Tom Aspinall fight night. Fun fact, Paul Craig would fight on not one, but 3 0-2 cards headlined by Tommy Aspinall. At the start of this fight, Paul Craig almost immediately gets a takedown and miraculously finds a way to his own back. Now, for most fighters, we would consider this a mistake. In Paul Craig's world, this is a reversal. From this point, Krylov dropped some pretty devastating ground and pound on the Scotsman, nearly putting Paul out in round 1. It was at this point that Paul Craig activated Angry Scotsman mode and showed Nikita Krylov why you should
never piss off a Scotsman,
securing the win via his signature triangle choke about 4 minutes into round 1. I think it's fair to say this is the peak of Paul Craig's career. Unfortunately, Paul would go 1-6 with 1 no contest following the Krylov win. First of these 6 losses came once again at the O2 Arena on now the main card of a Tom Aspinall fight night against Volkan Oezdemir. This fight had a pretty competitive round 1, with Volkan clearly taking rounds 2 and 3. It is the first decision loss of Paul Craig's career. Paul couldn't really secure takedowns against Volkan here, continuously pulling guard, and Oezdemir did not want to engage on the ground. Each time, Paul would get up, slightly more labored than the last. Now, Paul did not get destroyed here. There is a reason it went to a decision, but he was clearly a step behind here in the striking. Something I noticed across Paul's fights, he did not seem to have a lot of snap in his shots. He lands a decently clean head kick against Volkan in this fight in round 1, and it doesn't even wobble him. In fact, Volkan immediately pressed forward, trying to get into a firefight boxing exchange with Craig. And mind you, this is in 2022, 2 years removed from Volkan Oezdemir getting slimed out by Jiri Prochazka. So while I wouldn't call Volkan chinny, he certainly could be knocked out. It's something I saw time and time again while watching these fights. Had Craig been able to improve his striking to a point where he could get a bit more respect, he may have found more success in his wrestling game and had a better opportunity to fight from the top position rather than from his guard. Following the Oezdemir loss, we would see Craig make his return 6 months later on the undercard of his former foe Jamahal Hill's title fight with Glover Teixeira. In this fight, he would be taking on Brazilian contender Johnny Walker in his home of Brazil. At this point, Craig was still ranked in the top 10, whereas Johnny Walker was ranked 12. After about 2 minutes of walking around, Paul Craig would catch a teep from Johnny Walker. Unfortunately for Craig, he did not act fast enough when catching this teep and ate a strong right hand from Johnny Walker. This fight is a great example of just how athletic Johnny Walker is, balancing on one leg while delivering serious power shots to Paul Craig's chin, eventually dropping him and finishing him off with hammer fists. This fight honestly had such a meme finish to it, it only made sense for a pairing of Johnny Walker and Paul Craig to see this kind of ending. Now on a 2-fight loss streak, Paul Craig made a drop to middleweight, a decision that many, including myself at the time, were intrigued by. Craig would make his UFC middleweight debut against a ranked opponent in Andre Muniz. This was a good stylistic matchup, considering Muniz was also known for his submissions, most notably when he ended the career of Jacare Souza via brutal armbar. Luckily for Craig, this fight was not in Brazil. It was once again in London at the O2 on the main card of a Tom Aspinall fight night. The first round was competitive, with Andre Muniz winning it on all 3 judges' scorecards. But as we know, scorecards rarely mattered in Paul Craig's career. It was honestly quite funny seeing someone trying to triangle choke Paul Craig, but Muniz was not able to secure a submission over the Scotsman. In round 2, Paul gets a takedown and secures guard position, which we all know is in fact his goal. Muniz then proceeded to blatantly headbutt Paul Craig, which caused the referee to stand them up, which I would argue is helping Muniz considering Paul Craig wants to be on his back. But much like his countryman Shogun, Muniz found out why you should never piss off a Scotsman. Paul then blast double-legged Muniz, taking him down and securing top mount, dropping elbows on him until the fight got called off. Things were really looking up at this point. The move down to middleweight had breathed new life into Paul's career, given he had just beaten one of the best grapplers in that division. Perhaps at this smaller weight class, Paul Craig would have more success with his wrestling and be able to win more from the top position. Unfortunately, this was not the case, and this was in fact the last win of Paul Craig's MMA career. Paul would return just 4 months later to headline a UFC Apex event, now facing the number 10 ranked Brendan Allen. This was not a good fight for Paul Craig. He got outclassed on the feet, eventually losing due to rear naked choke. If the Brendan Allen fight had stopped the Paul Craig middleweight hype train, the Caio Barralho fight killed it. Back for what would be his final fight in Brazil, now with blonde hair, Paul Craig was being fed to the 15-1 contender Caio Barralho, and he said in interviews he knew just as much what the UFC wanted here, for the young contender to beat up on old Paul Craig. But he was here to once again shock the world as an underdog. Unfortunately, this was not the case. There was a huge speed difference between the young Brazilian and the now 35-year-old Paul Craig, and Paul would get knocked out in round 2 after Barralho avoided engaging with him on the ground. 5 months later, Paul would have his final fight against an undefeated prospect, as well as his final fight at middleweight against Bo Nickel. This fight between two high-level grapplers actually played out on the feet, something we've seen time and time again produce banger fights. This was not one of those times. The fight was a bit of a snoozer, with Bo mostly throwing overhands and Paul mostly throwing body kicks, eventually leading to the final career decision loss of Paul Craig, losing unanimously 30-27 across all 3 judges' scorecards. This was the final middleweight fight of Paul Craig's career, and I think it's unfortunate we didn't see him enter the weight class earlier. I think he really could have had more success with his wrestling at 185, but all 4 of his middleweight matchups were against proficient grapplers. On the other hand, maybe he would have done worse at 185. While I think he would have had more success securing his takedowns, any gains in the wrestling may have been outweighed on the feet, where the holes in his defense would likely have been exploited by the much faster guys at 185. Still, I wish we had seen the Bear Jew go up against just one striking specialist at 185. Paul Craig would then step up on only 2 weeks' notice to face Rodolfo Bellato back at light heavyweight, only for Bellato to pull out the day of the fight for a herpes infection. The matchup was then rebooked for UFC Atlanta about a month later. This fight is probably the worst flop I've ever seen in the UFC. Paul sort of lands an up kick against a Bellato who is on one knee. However, upon further review, the axe kick style up kick landed more on the collarbone area, barely touching the face of Bellato, who then immediately fell back protesting and then pretended to go unconscious. This isn't just my opinion, this was really the consensus of everyone on MMA YouTube, as well as just MMA fans in general. I'm honestly surprised this guy still signed with the UFC after this. This has to be the worst acting I've seen. Bellato is no Aljamain Sterling, that is for sure. Now, this might be biased for me, but I think this should have been ruled as a TKO via retirement. If you weren't actually fouled and you chose to stop fighting, that's a TKO as far as I'm concerned. And now we're back at the final fight of Paul Craig's career, less than 2 weeks ago from the recording of this video at UFC Paris, where Paul got starched by a last-second elbow in round 1, courtesy of Lithuanian light heavyweight Modestas Bukauskas. And while I would have loved to see Paul Craig leave on a win, I was happy to see him retire here with nothing left to prove in his UFC run. And now we can answer the original question: how good was Paul Craig really? I give Paul Craig's MMA career 7 out of 10 haggises. I think considering how late Paul started his career, reaching rank 8 within the UFC's light heavyweight division and notching 8 performance bonuses is more than anyone could have ever expected. Paul Craig had a hell of a UFC run. Perhaps some different approaches to training and game planning could have resulted in some more victories along that way, or maybe just some smarter choices in when he took turnarounds. But Paul Craig was a game fighter who stepped up on short notice many times and always was down for a fight. He almost never went to a decision, either winning by the sword or dying on his shield. And for that, you gotta give him respect. Hats off to Paul Craig, and cheers to you, mate. Oh, Shout out to Paul Craig and his podcast, Leathered, which you can catch on YouTube. Fair warning, his accent can be a bit hard to understand if you're from this side of the pond. Well, guys, that's a wrap on the career recap for Paul Craig. This is my first time recapping a fighter's career, so if you'd like to see me do more of these videos, let me know in the comments below. Until next time, Scotland! Man, this face paint really makes me want to revolt against the English, but that does come naturally to me as an American. Shout out Scotland, man. I haven't had one of these since the last time I went to Scotland, and I missed them. Until next time, y'all. Cheers.
What we do here is go back.
Paul Craig by submission, mate.